in the field, one of the biggest problems, they don't know what they have. It explodes, somebody's close to it, somebody can get hurt, somebody can die. I see it as a huge problem. It would probably scare many people if you went out to some of these locations and saw the technology running on Windows XP, Windows NT, Sun Microsystems. I mean, things that are 30-year-old technology that are still running modern day critical infrastructure site. It can be scary. So I can buy the best tools in the world and they do nothing. He needs to trust. So when I talk to that engineer, I can talk to him and I can explain to him the technology and cyber things that he doesn't understand. I can lock you down so much in security that you can't do your job.
Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting or security program. And today we actually brought on a special guest. So with us, we have Aaron Crow. Aaron Crow's the Chief Technology Officer of Industrial Defender, and he's going to talk a little bit more about his background later. But thanks for joining us, Aaron.
Hey, Dan, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me and having me on. I'm excited.
And so what we're going to cover today, we're going to hop into what industrial or OT cybersecurity is. For some of you, this might be a new field. It is a bit of a niche field in the cybersecurity space. So we're going to talk through what it is. We're going to spend the middle portion of this talking through how you can actually break into OT or industrial cybersecurity, both as a new hire and also maybe transitioning someone or transitioning over from the IT side. And then finally, in the latter half of this, we're going to talk through what you can do as an asset owner, common mistakes asset owners make protecting environments, and what asset owners can do both immediately and in the long term to secure themselves. And we're going to focus on, we always try to balance these talks with kind of what you can do immediately for free, and then what might be something you need with a partner or with a third party. So let's get kicked off. So Aaron, what would you say the definition of industrial or OT cybersecurity is? Like, what is it?
Sure. So, that obviously, even if you're not in the space, you've probably heard of OT as a buzzword, IoT, OT. I come from, and I know we'll get into my background in a bit, but, industrial and OT cybersecurity is really, if you think about, there's a lot of things in the world, power plants and manufacturing facilities, and there's a lot of things that run those things, right? So it's no different than your IoT at your house, your automation that you have. All of those things need to be protected because they provide a service. Instead of just turning on my lights, they're running a power plant, or they're controlling a line, or they're managing a piece of equipment. So obviously there's safety and availability requirements around those things. So IT and OT is really, the OT side of things is really around securing those business processes that are using automation and technology to make it easier instead of a manual process where a person has to go move a valve, et cetera. I've got technology. And because of that technology, I've brought all of the cyber concerns and networking concerns into these worlds that traditionally in the past were analog and manual with people. The more I automate, it makes it easier, faster. But now I bring all those IT. So it's really, how do I approach the cyber issues while enhancing and creating that level up for my business process?
Something you hit. It's fascinating across the security or across the history of these devices, because you take, programmable logic controllers, PLCs, right? The Lego bricks that go into most factories, right? And you look at the history, right? And if you look at like Schneider Electric's Modicon PLCs, right? They're some of the original PLCs, or the first generation created. And those PLCs, right? They were created actually from the auto manufacturing industry, right? And back in that day, instead of having computers switching signals, they literally had hard-coded wires run from system to system. And so, you talk in the 70s when literally everything had to be hardwired to each other. And then, the advent of these PLCs, right, where now you have a computer making a decision. Obviously, the first ones were still using serial communications. They weren't using network drivers. Has opened all kinds of fun because people like poking at industrial protocols, but they forget, like, hey, this industrial protocol was designed for a simpler time, and someone just decided, right, to throw it into a TCP/IP packet and send it.
They just change it over. Like a lot of the systems that you see out there are old serial 4 to 20 milliamp, hardwired connected. And they just, these OEMs really just take out that medium, change it from serial, and just add an Ethernet converter in there. And they're sending the same thing across it. They're just using, IP and Cat5. instead of, a serial connection. It's still using the same technology from the 60s and 70s. It's just pushing it across longer distances and it's going across switches and routers. But they don't always work to make their product or that capability any different. They just bundle it into a package and send it across that medium.
And what would you say? So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of hype out there, right? And especially, and we can say the S word is Stuxnet here, right? So Stuxnet was 2008, right? Everyone still pretends it's a new problem when, hey, we've had cases now since 2008. We have now to where there's more vendors in the security space, more vendors in other space. There's venture capital money behind, funding this problem. How legitimate would you say is the OT cybersecurity threat? What areas is it in? Is it in power? Is it in refining or in, oil and gas? Like, what's the significance of this threat, when you do look at those PLCs under the hood, right?
Kind of going off of what we just talked about, right, is a lot of the technology in these spaces are older. I've got PLCs. I'm going to have a lot of systems in these areas, whether it be critical infrastructure, so a power utility, power generation, or a manufacturing facility, wastewater, these regional power companies, all of these things are running, much of the equipment that they're running on is older. They may have a PLC. And in these environments, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's really expensive to go and just retroactively just replace everything. It's not like in IT where every 2 years I get a new laptop. I'm replacing servers on a 2 to 3 year life cycle. I just plan that in my budgetary. The budgets on the OT side forever have been 10, 15, 20 years life cycles. They design these pieces and parts of these components to fit in this life cycle for 20 years. So that's what they built, when they built these plants, when they built the manufacturing facilities, when they built power plants. You go to a nuclear power plant in the United States, they're all analog. Now they have some digital components, but they've got tertiary, primary, secondary, and tertiary devices. The first two are analog. They're the old school wired. The risk is that all of these old devices are there. The buzzword that I hear all the time is the IT and OT convergence. And it's not a new term. It's been around forever. That process has been happening, but it's really around how does business get more data out of their systems? How do they make it more efficient? How can I do it with less people? How can I push this envelope, be more efficient, all of those things. But anytime I start adding those capabilities in and those enhancements, I'm adding complexity, security concerns, et cetera. But on the flip side, even if, let's say, because I get this all the time, well, I'm a plant manager. Well, I'm just going to disconnect from the corporate network. I'm going to air gap and I don't have to do any of this stuff. Unfortunately, that's also not a solution because that just removes one attack vector, right? So I can still bring things in with SneakerNet, supply chain things. I see it all the time where you go to a power plant or you go to a manufacturing facility and they try to make something work, something breaks. So they run to Walmart and they get a switch or, a USB drive or something like that because they need to get their process up. But they don't know that that device may have some inherent bug or some, something from the supply chain that caused a problem. So all those to say, there's a lot of risks in this OT space, not to mention that on the IT side, you've got network admins and I've got firewall admins and I've got entire teams that are focused on securing the servers and making sure they're patched and they're tested. And I've got threat hunters and all this stuff. In OT, most of the time, they're just engineers. And I don't mean just like they're less super intelligent people, but that's not their job. It's not that they can't do it. It's that they have to make sure the plant runs. They don't have time to focus on cyber risks on these devices. They're just making sure the device is running, the equipment that it's controlling is running, and the plant process is working to create whatever widget, whether it's an electron or a can of Coca-Cola. They're focused on that part. So finding people and budget, people, process, and technology. It's not all a technology problem. It's really around having people that can help and understanding where I need those people and what they should be doing. I see it as a huge problem. It would probably scare many people if you went out to some of these locations and saw the technology running on Windows XP, Windows NT, Sun Microsystems. I mean, things that are 30-year-old technology that are still running modern day critical infrastructure sites. It can be scary.
With people, process, and technology, you hit a good kind of next question. And I got this. So I was out at a major asset owner once at a major utility company. One of the plant managers asked me, we did a talk through threat hunting. We talked them through how to secure a plant. Yep. And at the end, one of the interesting questions he had was, what's the cost if we just don't do anything, right? Because to your point, you go across people, process, and technology, all of those have an OpEx budget to them.
Yep.
The cost and the cost of putting your attention on one control versus another control, versus doing nothing and shoring up what you already have. There's opportunity loss in every way you go. So what would you say would be kind of the opportunity loss to ignoring the OT security problem? Even if if you're a NERC-CIP regulated power company, you can't ignore, security per se now, but what would you say is kind of that opportunity risk on ignoring security?
It really comes down to that business process, right? And if I've got a manufacturing, so we'll use something that's not regulated and required to have some kind of cyber process in their OT environment. So I look at a manufacturing facility, whether it's, I'm creating, remote controls or TVs or lights or whatever I'm creating. All of that stuff in a modern manufacturing facility is going to have some kind of automation. It's going to have, Rockwell PLCs that are plugged into an Ethernet network that's running, whatever Cisco switch, and it's connected to a firewall. They're probably going to have some basic level of something. If they do nothing and they just install it, the vendor comes in, because this is what normally happens, right? As the vendor comes in, the vendor says, hey, you need all this stuff. They deploy it, but it's just like anything. I can buy, behind me back there is my garage, and I've got a lot of tools in there. But if I don't have somebody that knows how to use them, or I don't take them out and use them and know what to do with them, they don't do me anything. So I can buy the best tools in the world and they do nothing. Having the tools alone is not enough. So the risk by doing nothing is that something happens. You see things in the news all the time. The Colonial Pipeline hit, which that wasn't even a true OT hit. They hit a system that was allowed them to build revenue. That's how they charged the gas that was going down the pipeline. And because they couldn't bill anymore, they turned everything off because they weren't going to just send gas down for free. The risk is my business process goes down. It takes me a long time to get it back up. And during that time, I've lost revenue. How much revenue? It depends on the site and how much, my loss is, how long I would be down. But obviously, if it's that loss, the next step on that, the other loss is safety, especially in manufacturing and a lot of these locations. Anytime you're talking OT, I've got hard hats back on my bench, but it's because it's a safety culture. You wear steel toe boots, you wear PPE, you're doing all these things because there's potential impact to life and limb, right? If I run a system and it spins out, like Stuxnet, it spins a centrifugal out of it explodes, somebody's close to it, somebody can get hurt, somebody can die. That system can be physically removed, whether it takes me a long time with a turbine, it's a year-long wait, if not more, to rebuild a turbine. So a lot of loss, a lot of business cost. And then the other piece, obviously, is especially in today's environment, is reputation, business reputation, being on the, you see it all the time in the news and all these different players. You don't want to be in the news for a power plant or your manufacturing facility going down because it was hacked by whomever, whether it be a nation state or just some random person because you decided to not do anything.
There's huge significance to the point you get to of these environments. And, that's really, if you had to foot stomp something from this, right, to really emphasize it is, the consequences of not securing an industrial or OT environment. To your point, you mentioned life safety, you mentioned revenue. I mean, there's a lot you have to consider with those risks, right? So with it being such a big field, I mean, how did you get into this space? What was your career path to, becoming ultimately the CTO of a vendor in the space?
I started out in high school, kind of doing technology stuff. My first computer was a TRS-80. That Macintosh back there on the cabinet is one of my, first computers as well. It still works. It still powers up. So I've been in computers, pretty early on in my life. Hit me really well. I went to a small school for electrical engineering, but I was always working part-time jobs, whether at different companies doing like technology, IT, desktop. I started out as a desktop admin and then moved into networking, then moved into servers, technical architecture. So a lot of my time was in different industries. One of my first jobs in this was working for a power utility here in Texas, up in Amarillo area, doing server administration stuff. So it went from that, and then I moved into networking, which moved into it wasn't called cybersecurity back then. It was really just, making sure that my devices are locked down for least privilege. And it kind of morphed over the years. At some point, I came to work at another power utility here in the state of Texas, used to be called TXU, which actually, funny story, my father actually worked for 38 years. His almost entire career was at this place. I have a lot of history working in power utility and being around it from my family and all the people my dad hung around with. We worked at power plants. I lived in East Texas because of the power plant he worked at. So that 10 years I was brought in to do a particular job. And then they said, hey, we need to do something in this OT cyber stuff. It's not NERC CIP compliance. We need to do more. You're it. Because I had network security and I'd been doing it. But again, we didn't call it OT cybersecurity. It was just, I need to do some stuff there. So with that, I was 10 years there. I built an OT program at that company and then moved to one of the big four consulting firms. And then I did it at a larger scale across multiple clients, which ultimately led me to being here at Industrial Defender as the CTO, where, I'm really focused on growing the platform with the mindset and bringing the experience and knowledge that I have, not just trying to sell technology. Our product is great, but our product, it doesn't solve everything. No product does. What can we use to improve the security of all of our customers? And ultimately, when you're talking critical infrastructure, you're talking nations. Yeah.
And so you went the path of, being an engineer to kind of, if you will, drawing the short straw, which you sometimes see. Like, It's funny you tell that story. And I think of another site we were at on an engagement to where cybersecurity person in charge of the site was an electrical engineer that drew the short straw. And so they're like, go do all that cyber stuff. And so totally awesome person to work with. You did have to sometimes explain more of the cyber stuff, but
right.
For anyone going into the field, that's definitely something to understand that this field is, you need everyone in the room because everyone brings a different view. I mean, your view of the system as an electrical engineer versus someone that, maybe went a comp sci route through IT or, is starting out's different. And so what would you say? I mean, what would you say to people today that might be in the position of transitioning from, in your case, being on the engineering side or someone that wanted to go from IT to OT? What's the path you see viable?
The fortunate thing is I've built a few of these. So, when I started the OT program, I had to recruit OT people. And again, this was, 10 years ago when you couldn't do a search on LinkedIn or anything and find anybody that had OT cybersecurity in their name. Like it just didn't exist. It wasn't a term that was used yet. So I started working with people that, I recruited one of my best friends who'd worked in IT for his entire career. He'd never been to a power plant. He'd never been to an OT. He didn't know what the word OT meant, but I knew that he could troubleshoot. So I brought him on. And I knew he had networking capabilities. So it was, like Cisco switches and firewalls and routing and that kind of thing, right? So it's really just finding, because at the end of the day, OT uses the same technologies as IT. So I've got firewalls, I've got servers, I've got routing, I've got VMware, I've got, all of the differences is how do I use them and what do I push them? I need to patch things, but I'm not going to patch them at the same, or if at all, maybe I have to mitigate differently. So as far as how do you get into the space, it's really just finding somebody that's looking for that kind of work, but really just focusing on being good at all those things. Because ultimately it's about understanding those underlying things. And the thing I think that has made me, or one of the things that's made me super successful in this OT space is my understanding from working at power plants, from working and understanding the business process. So when I talk to that engineer, I can talk to him and I can explain to him the technology and cyber things that he doesn't understand in a way that doesn't make him feel stupid, but it makes him understand that I know I'm not going to do something that's going to break his stuff. He needs to trust that I understand his process, the things that I'm talking about or recommending or wanting to do. He trusts me enough to know that I know his process and that it's not going to break his things. Because ultimately it's all about trust. One of my mentors told me a long time ago, all business is the people business. I don't care if you're the janitor, the CEO, a programmer that never comes out of his dungeon. You still have to interact with people. If you want to excel and grow in your career, you have to be able to talk and interact and have personal relationships with people. And that's where all these things connect. So that personal relationship is huge. And then understanding the business process. Those are probably the two big pieces in getting into OT space.
So what about as a new hire? Because, as you and I both know, this is a field that has a real demand for really talented people in a lot of areas, everything from CIP compliance, right? Regulatory compliance that has, pretty big fees if you expose data. We saw a case, right, where a third-party security company exposed to utilities data on Amazon AWS, and that utility got billed, I think, 6 figures. And some of those fees are by the day. And so they can be extremely sharp. So, but you need those people on the regulatory side. You need, the actual threat hunters, red teamers, all of that. For someone starting out, and you mentioned trust a lot. How do you get into the field when you're truly entry level or you're a junior, right? How do you get people's trust to even start down the path of getting that knowledge and experience?
That's a really hard one. I saw an article right before we got on the call here, where there's a lot of entry level positions that are posted on LinkedIn or these job forums that have a requirement of 10 plus years experience. That's not an entry level position. If I were coming out of college, or if I were just a high school kid or whatever, I wanted to break into this field, look for internships, look for opportunity. There's a lot of small manufacturing. There's a lot of small, municipalities. There's a lot of opportunity out there. It's a very in demand field, but to your point, the hardest part is breaking in. So it's find a way to network, go to conferences. I was just at a conference in Houston a couple of weeks ago, and there were 3 or 4 college age individuals that were coming around asking every single person that they walk by, introducing themselves and networking. Hey, I'm doing this. I'm at this college. This is my degree. Do you have any internships? Do you have any job opportunities? Things like that. So a lot of it is going to be networking. And I really think no matter what industry you're trying to break into, that networking piece is huge. You can be the smartest guy in the world, but if you're not a team player and you can't communicate your thought and interact in a team setting, it doesn't matter. I've had a lot of people on teams in the past that have worked for me that they've been really smart, but either they don't get along with the team or they can't communicate their feelings without losing, whatever, right? So that skill and working on that skill is hugely powerful. Understanding, going back to that, I'm a new guy in a company, communicating, hey, I know I'm new, but I have visions of getting here. So go talk to those people and ask them, hey, this is what I want to do. I know I'm not there yet, but how do I work to build trust? What do you need me to have? What skills would you be looking for me to be able to get there? And then go implement them and then come back to them. Okay, I did those things. Now what?
I think to that too, something also to point out, especially with this space, obviously with COVID, more and more companies are going remote and more, it's possible to do things remote. And, the labor force, right, is now competing against positions that can be done remotely. Another thing I would encourage, it came to mind with what you were saying, is realizing that this space is still very much a physical space. And there are plants and geographical, not as nice areas as the Bay Area or living up in New York or, down here in Texas and Austin. So being open to relocation, being open to flexibility, at least earlier in your career, right, might get you those opportunities to live. You might live in Beaumont, Texas. Sorry, people from Beaumont watching. You might live in Beaumont for a few years to build your skills and then move. Or you might go to Western Australia where you fly out for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, doing shifts, right, and coming back. But there's a lot of opportunities, I feel like, in maybe geographically less nice places also to kind of get that entry point possibly to the field.
Yeah. The other thing that comes up with that. So obviously working in power industry, power plants are not in downtown. They're in the middle of nowhere, right? You don't want your power plant in the middle of a highly populated place. It's ugly. They can't get so all those things are in the middle of nowhere. So you're 100% right there. Finding people in those locations is hard. The other piece is international. So I know Dubai and UAE, all those places, they're just fighting for people to help. Having that flexibility to be willing to, either go international, go to these smaller towns that have it. The other piece is, I mentioned I worked for EY, working for somebody like that where they have entry level type roles, there's a high travel requirement. There's a lot of those other requirements that come along with it. You get exposed to a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily if you just take an entry level job at a local company and you're not in front of anybody. So it's hard to build trust when I'm remote. It's hard to get those opportunities unless you really go outside of the norm and find a path that can get you where you want to go.
So pivoting kind of to the last part of the talk. So we talked about security, right? And we talked about getting in some from a security perspective and from your experience, what are some common mistakes you see asset owners make? And what are some things they can do both in the immediate and long term, to work down those challenges, right? We obviously talked earlier with, people, process, and technology all being limited with.
It's funny being the CTO of a software company that sells a product in this space. You would think I would say, oh, well, you got to buy a product. No, honestly, I think the biggest mistake that people make in this space is they buy a tool before they've really even defined the problem. They see a product, whatever the product may be, and they go buy it. Is it wrong? Maybe not. Maybe it fills a void for them. But ultimately, it's hard to solve and understand what really my true problems are. I mean, it'd be like, you're driving your car and something's not right, but you don't know what it is. So I'm just going to go buy new tires. Your fuel pump is going bad. You solved some problem. Maybe your tires were needing to be updated, but you still didn't solve the problem. You didn't really understand. You didn't diagnose what the problem was. But it even gets worse in OT because many of these sites that I go to, it's not just me, but in the field, one of the biggest problems, they don't know what they have. They don't have an accurate asset inventory. Maybe they've got an asset inventory, but it's spread across multiple, a spreadsheet over here and it's on a SharePoint site over there. And Bob has some on his laptop and, Steve has the rest of it on, there is no uniform place. So when something like, Log4j or any of these big issues come out or a vulnerability comes out on a PLC, I don't even know how many I have. I don't know where they are. I don't know who to call to find out. So there's a long process to go through to just figure out, okay, how many of these things do I have before I could ever take action, change a firewall rule, go push a patch or send a person out and make a change to a configuration, whatever that may look like. So I would say the biggest thing I see people making mistakes on is buying technology before they truly have that baseline. So it's almost like you're building a house before you have the foundation. And that foundation, I believe, is really your asset inventory and really understanding. It's hard to know what bad looks like if you don't know what good looks like. So to know good, I have to understand what all my devices are, where they are, what business function they have, what is my risk to my organization. It's more than just an asset name and a Rockwell PLC with, and Bob's the owner and it's got this, firmware on it. That's one part of the conversation, but the rest of it is what is that business function? What is the risk if I lose it? How much am I willing to spend to protect that thing? Or is it something, on a device that I'm going to, end of life at the end of the year? And if it goes down, I've got to back up and I don't really care. So really that understanding.
Yeah. And in plan architecture, right? Location matters to that, right? So
absolutely.
Where in IT, you can just do boundary monitoring. For us, if you're trying to capture the traffic between a engineering workstation capable of changing a PLC and a PLC, if you're sitting on the boundary of that environment, you're likely not going to see those because those two devices are inside. And so I feel like I agree with you on the asset inventory, and I agree that it's sometimes a harder problem because people, to your point, will drop a solution in at a point and say, okay, we're good. And it's like, what's actually going through there? Or they're like, this asset inventory is empty. And it's like, well, none of the protocols that have that asset data you want are actually there, right? And to your point, they were probably sold the grand thing and then didn't have enough, kind of visibility on the engineering side to say, okay, no, here's the actual point where I can pick this information up.
Well, and the other piece that I see is either from one of two directions, either the board, IT, senior leadership on the corporate side, hey, I'm going to go buy this tool and we're going to push it down to the plants or we're going to push it down to the manufacturing facilities. So they do that, but the OT side doesn't understand it. They don't believe, it goes back to that trust thing. They don't trust IT. They don't trust corporate. So they don't allow it to get into the areas that would do the most good. So they're monitoring what they think is OT, but it's really just a boundary. So they're not seeing anything. So they bought this tool, but it's really not doing anything because the OT people, the guy that owns the actual process is saying, you're not bringing that into my environment because I haven't tested it. My vendor doesn't like it and I don't know anything about it. I'm not doing it. Or on the flip side, the location, the plant, the vendor, their vendor, the control vendor sells them a suite of something. Same thing though. The problem is they install this suite and then the vendor leaves, but there's nobody left managing the technology. So the technology stood up and they had an asset inventory or whatever the technology was that they sold them, but then they don't maintain it. So both of those scenarios are bad where technology didn't solve the problem. And it wasn't that the technology couldn't have potentially solved the problem. It's that neither side was talking to the other. The plant guys should have talked to somebody in IT and said, hey, we're going to get this thing. Do you have somebody that can own it after the vendor leaves? And on the flip side, the IT people should have been saying, hey, we'd like to do this. We want to work with you so you feel comfortable so that we can cover all of your systems, not just the boundary. Because this whole middle gray area is missed because neither side are talking to each other. They don't understand each other. And that's the piece that is needed the most is that understanding and that relationship building. And again, it all comes back to people. I can throw technology and I can architect a secure solution, but unless the plant manager understands it and the IT guy understands it, it's not going to work. So what are some of the immediate things? So we talked quite a few problems we hit on here, but I agree, very common ones. What are some of the things that an asset owner could immediately do to solve it? And then what are the long-term? What do you see as some of the lowest hanging fruit? Yeah. So simple things. And I know I keep beating this drum, but asset inventory is really key. Even if that's in a spreadsheet, it doesn't mean you got to go buy technology, right? It's really just understanding what I have. I mean, and beyond that, again, it's more than just it's a PLC, but it's really understanding. And like you said, Dan, it's that connection. Okay, this device is plugged into this switch and the workstation's over here, and that's how they communicate. Well, that all plugs in and really having an understanding of that data flow and how things are supposed to work. And where my gotchas are. If this thing goes down, do I have a single point of failure? What happens if it goes down? If I lose that, if it dies and I can't get one for a week, what will be the impact? And really going through almost like a tabletop and understanding, okay, now I know what my assets are. I know where they are. Now I need to understand how everything works together. So it's because in my experience, usually not one person understands all of that. Like usually there's a person that knows where everything is. There's another person that understands from a, business process, how everything kind of connects together. There's probably somebody else that maybe understands the technology side of it. And sometimes that's one guy, sometimes that's two or three. That really depends, but really understanding that. And then you take a step, you zoom out a little bit. And I'm a corporation and I have 50 sites or hundreds of sites, thousands of sites even. That becomes an exponentially larger problem because I have to have that same conversation at every one of those sites. Yep. How do I fix everything? I can't, right? There's ultimate tools. I can do all these different things. So then it's really just starting with a program and going to the basics from a corporate level. I really believe it's understanding what a program should look like and having some kind of program and building some kind of baseline of this is what we want to do. These are the asset types that we want to do it at, the site types we want to do it at, and then start building a plan, knowing that I can't just go boil the ocean and fix everything overnight, especially in OT. But having some kind of plan around what I want to do. How quickly am I going to do it? Building funding for people, process, and technology for years to come, and not just capital, because capital is easy to get, relatively easy to get. O&M, that O&M tail is the harder part, right? Is that the ongoing care and feeding of these technology, these people. That way, when I'm done with the project and I've solved for asset management or I've solved for whatever mitigation I'm trying to do, I have somebody that can run it and maintain it and it doesn't die on the shelf. And I'm not starting this whole process over again in 5 years, which unfortunately I see happen a lot. And I think you have to your point, I think what I've found, and especially going into plants too, where they didn't have much asset identification in place, their maturity was low on that. I think the big thing you have to accept if you're just starting, like you're starting from zero or extremely low maturity, is it's going to be a manual, painful process at first. Yep. Absolutely.
And, the people that can help you aren't just going to be the IT people or the OT security, the industrial cybersecurity people. It could be plant engineers, right? There were cases we went out and got the P&ID, the piping and instrumentation documents, some of the other plant design, and then actually walked through the plant and verified like, okay, hey, I see this device here and it's actually plugged in, right? Okay, I see this switch here and I know where all of those Ethernet cables are going. Yep. I know these boxes are here. Starting with some of the OEMs that do have asset identification tools, right? You might already be paying for a license. As an asset owner, if you're using Honeywell, right? They bought a company called Next9 and I think they put it into Shield. They can do a lot of asset ID using Honeywell Experion. Proprietary protocols and all that. But, you might have, as an asset owner, you might then have the kind of OEM built in already. And that steps your maturity up to a little bit, right? To the point of you're now not doing this by hand and updating this by hand. And then obviously like the super mature is when it's not as manual, it's not as painful. But I think to some people, like, they let perfection get in the way of that first step.
That's right.
Or they just don't talk to engineers, right? When, both on asset inventory and on red team engagements, some of our biggest successes have come from going to engineers that have been operators there for 15 years and being like, okay, how would you break this? Okay, what would happen if you lost this area, right? What keeps you up the most at night? And you want to watch, right? You want to watch some of the biases there, but it at least gives you some other opinions on potentially good starting points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talked about having some of the OEM vendors are doing, and a lot of them have done a really great job of incorporating these things because they've seen the problems. The bigger problem, in addition to that, is, hey, I've got a Honeywell, but I've got other things other than Honeywell. So Honeywell's solution will cover them. Emerson's solution will cover them. Foxborough, Rockwell, all that kind of stuff. But what about those third-party systems that are not included? You look at the Target attack that happened, right? It wasn't Target that got hit. It was one of their subcontractors. Like, it's always the small guy that's outside of the norm, that's not following the standard. That's the way in. And it's no different in OT is everything is fine. Everything's on the Honeywell system, except that one device over there that nobody seems to know about. And Bob's on vacation and he's the only one that knows anything about it. So we're just going to ignore that. And then it's ignored. And then it's the back door, or it breaks down and nobody really understood what it was and how impactful it was. And, that it was connected directly to the Honeywell system through a back door and bypassed the firewalls and all the security solutions you just did. And you just bypassed it all.
So we hit the technology side and we hit a bit. What would you say on the people and process side? What can people do both in a proactive state before something happens and then reactive? What mistakes are people making, and where do you see kind of the lowest hanging, most valuable fruit?
As we talk this IT OT convergence, I mean, you brought it up, right? It's talking to those plant engineers. It's talking to those operators. Those are the guys that know where the bodies are hidden. They know how the process works. They've worked in this power plant or this manufacturing facility or whatever. Maybe they built it. Maybe they've been there for 15 years or maybe it's just been 5, but they walk it every day and they're putting hands on this equipment and they're intimately aware when it breaks and they've had to troubleshoot how everything goes together. So it's like a mechanic that's worked on this particular car. You go to Toyota, you expect that the Toyota mechanic knows how to work on a Toyota. If you take your Toyota to a Chevy, he's still a good mechanic, but he just doesn't have the experience working on that particular car. It's not that he can't figure it out. It's just not going to be quite as fast. So same thing, like it's really that conversation and cross-training and having, red team events. You're probably not going to allow them to do that at a power plant, but how can you do that in a way that doesn't impact my operations, but still gets I want those IT people, those cybersecurity people having conversations with those plant engineers because they both need to understand the risks and what they're trying to solve and the use cases and the why, because ultimately they should be thinking of themselves, I'm on the same team. Like you look at a football team, I've got a quarterback, I've got linemen, I've got defensive people, like which role am I playing? But at the end of the day, we're all one team. I know that you're an offensive lineman and that's what you're going to do. But know that we need to be playing on the same playbook. So that way, you're pass blocking and I'm trying to run right behind you and you didn't block like that, right? Or you didn't run out for a pass or whatever the case may be. And it really comes down to that, building those relationships, having tabletop exercises, having your IT people, your cybersecurity people going to these locations, walking down these sites, understanding the trouble and why it's more difficult to do these things in an OT world. So when they're thinking about technology or processes, they understand the problem case that the OT people are having and the plant people are having, and why you can't just take IT policies and push them down in an OT space and expect them to work. And vice versa, I can't, from an OT perspective, I can't just say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to disconnect. You're not allowed in my world. Don't talk to me. I don't trust you. Like we've got to break down those barriers and have more communication between those teams and build processes that both parties are working with and for, playing from that same playbook.
Exactly. And this is where from the medium and long term, you talked IT/OT convergence, you've talked some of the challenges there. I feel like I haven't been a fan of IT/OT convergence because it creates an us versus them
Yeah.
When in reality, when you look at the maturity of a security program, you very well could have that plant data going back to a Splunk instance that only the SOC person in IT sees, also is actually centralized up and above the plan. And you could have, like I know a company, they have 2 incident responders for over 200 plants. And so you talk about communication and you talk about like, the process, like doing tabletops to run through those that are actually tailored to you. So Aaron and I, we did a tabletop together out in Austin a few months back, focused around trans security. It was a good tabletop. We've done it at DEF CON. It's good more for general awareness, but where I'm talking here on a tabletop is one very specific to that plan and very specific to how you would do it. It's the 2 a.m., the plant's suddenly gone down, or 2 a.m., like what are the scenarios that keep you up? And it's focusing not just on the technical side, but who are you calling at 2 a.m.? Who are you waking up? When I was at the Air Force CERT, right, we had that threshold of when do you call to wake up a 3 or 4 star general on a security event, right?
Right.
You need to know when that threshold is, and especially if you're a regulated company, right, to where there are NERC fines for, bursting certain incident response requirements or reporting requirements. That process is super important. So something like tabletops, why like threat hunts is the same deal, right? Get those incident responders out doing threat hunts so they know what the plant looks like. So their boots are dirty. So they know the people. So the plant manager trusts them, because oftentimes when you're at that level too, we talked a lot about trust earlier. Yeah. You need that trust going in, because that trust will make or break you. And especially if you're in an incident response scenario, you're responding, the stress is going to be high, anxiety is going to be high. People are getting tired as they can't sleep. And so, having that plan ahead of time helps. And, a fun thing I did with one of our clients once is actually played in GridX with one of our retainer customers, which was fun because they had never engaged a third-party incident response company during an exercise. So they wanted to test like, okay, in the confines of this major utility exercise, GridX is a major national utility exercise. They wanted to be like, okay, what does it look like? And what are our people going to do when they get hit by this scenario? And so, tabletopping, threat hunts, understanding process. Asset inventory is another good one too, because if you do that really well, you're going to begin to see where your blind spots are, where your weaknesses are, where you can and can't see. And so it's if you're bored in the prep time or bored in kind of that proactive time, there's probably a lot more you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you hit something else there, that IT and OT, we really use different language. So, I didn't serve, but, I've heard I've talked to a lot of individuals that, pre 9/11, and they talked about how, this organization and that organization, they had things, but they had no way to share information. They had nowhere to communicate risks and combine their intelligence or all of that, right? It's the same problem we're having in IT and OT in these organizations. Right now, if I take an IT person to a power plant, he doesn't understand anything about the power plant. He may have worked at this power company for 20 years, but he's been in the IT side or he's been on the business side, and he doesn't understand. He's never worn a hard hat and steel toe boots, and vice versa. So having those conversations in those spaces, bringing the IT people into the OT world, not to just do a tour, but to really understand a day in a life, work with that operator, walk around with them, understand how they do their job. And then you can start having a conversation. Again, I think it goes to one of the reasons I've been so successful in this space is because when I go talk to a plant manager, he knows that I know what I'm talking about. Not because I'm using buzzwords, but because I understand and I can talk to him in a language he understands, and I understand his business process, but I can do the same thing on the IT side. I can talk to the IT, the CISO, the CEO. I can explain to them the business side. Not in obviously they understand the business side, but from an OT perspective, how everything on that side works. And that language barrier, it's almost like they're speaking different languages. And that is a big problem that we have to overcome. And some companies have done it, have begun, integrating those things. But most places I see, OT is a completely separated, islanded environment from IT, and they almost have no crosstalk. unless it's fighting, unless it's a get out of my space. This is mine. You can't do this. And then IT processes are so hard. Many times OT, something's broke. Instead of going through the traditional IT path to buy a switch or a desktop or whatever, I need it today. And if I go through the IT process, they're going to fight me. They're going to want me to use some other product. They're going to, ask me and qualify. Where I'm just going to go grab my P card. I'm going to go run down to Best Buy. I'm going to get the thing that I need to make the job work, and I'll have it fixed by tomorrow. And I'm on about my day. So those are two big issues: communication and making those processes work in a way that fit the business. I can lock you down so much in security that you can't do your job. And then I'm just going to bypass it. I put passwords on screens. I tape doors so they don't lock. There's all sorts of things we could do to make that. So
awesome. So any last thoughts? I mean, we've run a bit long. So any last thoughts to the group as we wrap up?
No, I mean, we covered a lot. I appreciate it. It's OT is an exciting space to be in. We need more and more people here. Happy to have conversations with anyone if they have questions or whatever, anything we covered here. I've got a lot of experience and a lot of passion for this environment and this space. I love talking about it and kind of helping guide people to get in, because like I said, we need more and more good folks to help this battle.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for tuning in this week. This was a great discussion with Aaron. Hopefully you learned a lot. The OT space, as he said, there's huge wide variety of fun challenges to deal with, if you will. So we hope this was helpful, and we hope to see you back next week. Thanks a lot.